The crisis in Minnesota hits the courts. Two fatal shootings of U.S. citizens at the hands of federal agents have raised the stakes as Democrats and civil rights groups are rushing to sue. We will break it all down, including the big courtroom fight that is brewing for this Friday, when the head of U.S. Customs and Immigration Enforcement is set to take the stand. Plus, the suspect accused of planting pipe bombs near the RNC and DNC just before the January 6th Capitol attack. What to expect as he's back in court with a fight over his detention. And the latest on the mid-decade redistricting war. California's Democratic-friendly map heads to the Supreme Court, while a ruling in Virginia has thrown a new curveball. I'm Zach Schonfeld, legal affairs reporter at The Hill and co-author of the Gavel newsletter, your weekly look at the intersection of courts and national politics, which you can get in your inbox every Wednesday morning by signing up at thehill.com/newsletters. And joining me to talk about all of the courts and legal news this week is my Gavel co-author, my partner in covering crime and fellow legal affairs reporter here at The Hill, Ella Lee. Ella, this week we have got so much to get to as the scene in Minnesota becomes front and center in the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. A lot of aspects to unpack here, but let's start by talking about this weekend and Saturday's fatal shooting of 37-year-old Alex Pretti, who was slain during that confrontation with federal immigration agents that has now been shared widely on social media. So here we are, you and I talking here a few days later. We've seen a lot of action since Saturday. Walk us through what is the latest on the shooting and where does the federal investigation stand?
So right now, it looks like the investigation into the fatal shooting of Alex Pretti, 37-year-old intensive care nurse, is limited to whether the Border Patrol agents who engaged with him and ultimately killed him violated their training standards. And that's what's also known as a use of force review. So what we know from video footage of the incident is that Pretti appeared to be recording video with his phone before things escalated, which is when federal officers realized that he had a gun in his possession. Now, that firearm was legally held by Pretti. It wasn't in his hands at any visible point, and based on the videos, it appears to have been taken out of his possession by the officers before he was shot, seemingly at least 10 times. But this type of probe that the Department of Homeland Security rather is conducting typically focuses on how officers conduct themselves and the tactics that they used. It's a lot narrower than a criminal investigation would be, and in a criminal investigation, we'd be looking at things like whether Pretty's civil rights were violated.
Absolutely. And of course, as this investigation has been moving forward, we've seen a lot of filings coming to court from some of these federal officials, the Department of Homeland Security, as you mentioned, as well as some sub-agencies within that. And as you look to the declaration that we got in court from someone like Mark Zito, who leads the St. Paul office of the investigatory unit within ICE. This is the agency leading the federal probe here. As you read that declaration, Ella, you mentioned this is really, at least so far, what we've been hearing from the feds is that this is just a use of force investigation. But there has been no suggestion at this point, at least from the federal level, that they are considering any sort of criminal charges or scrutiny of that count. Mark Zito wrote in this declaration that this is a, quote, use of force encounter. Now, Ella, another big thing that I know you've been watching over these last few days since the shooting is there's also been a big fight between the federal level and the state level here, with a big fight over what to do with the evidence in this shooting and who gets access to it. Tell us more.
All right, so after the shooting, Minnesota officials rushed to court to tell a judge that federal personnel had ordered state and local investigators to leave the scene. They filed a lawsuit basically demanding that all evidence needs to be preserved. And in this emergency request, we saw Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison and Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty call the federal government's actions here a sharp departure from normal best practices. The Justice Department, on the other hand, is saying that there are already federal policies in place that require evidence preservation, so they don't need a judge to intervene and say that they need to keep things under lock and key. They submitted sworn declarations from officials at ICE, the FBI, Border Control, all of them supporting this idea that those policies are being followed. And there was a hearing on Monday over the matter, but the judge there, a Trump appointee, hasn't issued a ruling yet. However, in the meantime, he did say that that evidence needs to be preserved.
Yeah, and that Mark Zito official over at the investigatory unit at ICE calling those in court filings, quote, stringent requirements that he says federal agents, not only that's the policy, but he has been trying to make the case that these rules are in fact being followed and that there's no need for concern here. Now, of course, this is not the first time that we have seen this battle over evidence in even just the last few weeks. Of course, just a few weeks before this recent shooting over the weekend, we had the fatal shooting of Renee Good. Has a similar evidence battle at all come up in that shooting investigation too?
So, when Renee Good was shot and killed earlier this month, Minnesota's investigative agency, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, they were initially part of a joint investigation with the FBI, but the federal investigators who were running that operation cut them out. And as a result of that, local investigators lost access to case materials, evidence that includes Good's car, which is where she was killed, shell casings, and witness accounts, which of course include the Border Patrol or the ICE agents, rather, who were involved in that incident. And so these evidence preservation fights become particularly important when you consider the fact that murder, which is a criminal charge that might be looked at, doesn't have a statute of limitations, which means that local officials or a future administration could pursue charges against the officers involved in these shootings in years to come if there's a
All right, well, we will wait to see the rulings there on that evidence fight, especially from that Trump-appointed judge in St. Paul, Judge Eric Tostrad, seeing that case that has been brought by the state and local officials there. But as those shooting investigations continue, Ella, I want to just broaden our conversation and talk a little bit more about what we're seeing going on all over the Twin Cities. And this is, of course, something that we have seen ever since the administration announced Operation Metro Surge back in December, where we have seen now hundreds, if not thousands, of federal immigration agents there out on the streets in Minnesota. And we have seen the state not only, talking about evidence and attacking it that way in the courts, they're also in court just trying to end this whole ICE deployment altogether in a lawsuit that's being brought by Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison.
Right. Minnesota plus the Twin Cities, which are Minneapolis and St. Paul, they sued to get ICE out of the state after Good was killed, so a couple weeks ago. And they've equated this surge of federal immigration enforcement officers to a federal invasion. And that they're saying that Minnesota was essentially targeted because of its opposing views from the Trump administration.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just going to read you a quote right from their motion to the judge asking for an emergency injunction here. And it's all focused on President Trump's motivation. I'll just read you a bit from it. Quote, President Trump's and defendants' motives are clear. A desire to punish a state electorate that did not vote for him, a desire to punish politicians who stand up to him, and a desire to punish immigrants because of their race and national origin. What is equally clear, the state says, is that defendants are not motivated by a good faith desire to improve public safety. Ella, does this case, is that really what it all comes down to, is how the judge views this? Is the Trump administration, going to rule essentially on, are they responding to public safety, or is this a question of First Amendment retaliation? Is that the core of this case?
I think that quote right there really is at the heart of the lawsuit. The local officials are claiming that the administration is retaliating against the city and the state, both in violation of the First Amendment, but also then infringing on their sovereignty and their rights under the 10th Amendment. And so we've seen Minnesota officials really be staunchly pushing back on the administration's immigration enforcement efforts, even as President Trump has suggested that they are rebelling against the federal government. Right now, there are roughly 3,000 ICE and Customs and Border Protection personnel on the ground in Minneapolis conducting enforcement. The government said that in court filings. And the local officials have asked the judge to declare that surge unlawful, block its implementation, and on top of that, block a series of specific tactics that have been used by federal agents in the state. And so there was a hearing in that case on Monday as well, but Judge Catherine Menendez, who's a Biden appointee, she asked for additional briefing before she rules. That briefing's set to come in today on Wednesday, and we could get a ruling at any point after that.
Yeah, we'll see what the government has to say in that final brief coming in tonight. But already they've been trying to convince the judge, writing in court filings. They said, quote, the basic concept of our system of federalism is simple, going on to say that in this case, the state of Minnesota and certain of its political subdivisions seek to turn that system upside down. The Trump administration, of course, trying to make the case here that agreeing with the state and granting this injunction against ICE would essentially be putting state interests above federal interests. Similar arguments we've seen, of course, the Trump administration make in all of these blue cities, where we've seen them in these major enforcement efforts, not just in Minneapolis, but in cities all over. Now, in addition to Ella, to all these suits that we've been talking about so far, but wait, there's more. In addition to the suit by the Attorney General to try to get ICE out of Minnesota entirely, We've also seen some private plaintiffs get in on the action with this suit by Minnesota residents backed by the ACLU. Specifically, they are not necessarily trying to kick ICE out entirely, but this is a lawsuit focused on ICE's tactics. Tell us about this one.
So before the state got involved, these private plaintiffs, as you mentioned, backed by the American Civil Liberties Union, they're looking at these more aggressive tactics that ICE is using. And Judge Menendez, who also oversees that case brought by the state, had blocked federal personnel responding to protests in Minnesota from retaliating against peaceful demonstrators using pepper spray or other non-lethal munitions, crowd dispersal tools. But as of this week, those restrictions are not in effect after a federal appeals court on Monday sided with the Trump administration and said that the limits were too broad, too vague. And so for now, those limits are on hold, and ICE is able to operate the way that it initially was. Now, granted, that decision is only temporary while the appeals court resolves the administration's appeal. But for now, it means that the tactics are here to stay.
Temporary, but the ACLU calling this ruling incredibly disappointing. They said that in their statement after that appeals court ruling landed on Monday night. So we will wait for that case to move forward as well. One other line of cases, Ella, that I want to ask you about on the situation in Minnesota. And that is, we've been talking so far about all these cases that are brought by, state Democratic officials, big private groups like the ACLU. But there's also this whole wave of cases that are just being brought by actual individual migrants, don't always have, some top-notch legal representation, and filing these cases through what is known as a habeas petition, all contesting their individual circumstances. Walk us through this line of cases and also tell us about the fight that is now brewing in one of them specifically with a big hearing now set for Friday.
So hundreds of migrants have challenged the legality of their detention, as you mentioned, via habeas petitions. And on Friday, we've got this big fight brewing because the acting ICE director is going to actually have to take the stand and sort of explain himself. And that's because Patrick Schiltz, who's the chief judge of Minnesota's federal district court, he sort of reached his wits' end. He indicated in court filings on Monday. This is in the case of Juan Hugo Tobe Robles, who is one of the migrants challenging his detention. And he essentially said, the migrant essentially said in filings that he remains detained despite a judge's ruling that the administration either has to give him a bond hearing or release him. And that was really sort of the breaking point for the chief judge here. And he said that ICE Director Todd Lyons needs to come to court on Friday and explain why he shouldn't be held in contempt for violating court orders that are sort of coming out of this administration's immigration crackdown in Minnesota. And all to say, I mean, the court has been swamped with lawsuits challenging ICE's tactics, challenging the Trump administration's efforts to sort of shield the agency from scrutiny. And I think that here what we're seeing is sort of a judge out of patience. He's going straight to the source. He's putting him on the stand, and we're going to get a little bit of an explanation here.
And not just any judge, of course, the chief federal district judge in Minnesota. He has been seeing not only his own caseload that he has to deal with, but of course those extra responsibilities, seeing what those cases look like coming into the court. So he's of course very familiar with just frankly the flood of cases. Every time I refresh the page, it seems like there is just a new one of these habeas petitions, challenging whether it's in Minnesota or somewhere else. And another point, Ella, that I just want to bring up is the fact that the judge here, Judge Schiltz, who you've been talking about, is someone who has a lot of respect and conservative circles. He is not someone who, a lot of these other judges, oftentimes, ruling against the Trump administration, one of the criticisms we hear is that they're appointed by Democratic presidents. The Trump administration and the president's allies accuse a lot of these judges of essentially being judicial activists in robes. But this is a judge who was appointed by former President George W. Bush. He has been on the bench now for almost 2 decades. He's been on the bench since 2006. He is someone who has quite some clerkship credentials. He clerked for Judge Antonin Scalia back when he was on a mid-level appeals court. And then when Scalia got up to the Supreme Court and started to become one of its leading conservative justices, then this judge, Judge Schiltz, went up and clerked for Scalia up on the Supreme Court. So I think, as compared to some of these other judges, a lot of those don't exactly have a Scalia clerkship on their resume. So certainly here, when you look to these judges' comments saying that he has been, quote, extremely patient, but that his patience has come to an end, definitely a little bit of a different message when it comes from someone like Judge Schiltz as opposed to some of those judges appointed by Democratic presidents who we've seen again and again rule against President Trump. All right, well, that has been a lot on Minnesota. I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot more about this in the coming weeks, but I want to take the last few minutes in the moments we have to talk about the other court news that has been going through the courts over the last week. And I want to start by talking about a case that is just after we finish talking here. I know you're about to head into court for a big hearing with the suspect in the pipe bombing case, the suspect accused of planting pipe bombs near the RNC and DNC in the lead up to January 6th. What is this hearing all about this afternoon, and what should we expect heading into it?
Yeah, so this is the first hearing before the trial judge, Judge Amir Ali. So a good chunk of the hearings likely just going to be an update on where things stand, moving from sort of the magistrate court into the district court. The suspect, Brian Cole Jr. here, faces two federal charges alleging that he planted pipe bombs outside the Democratic and Republican National Committee offices on the eve of January 6, 2021 Capitol riot. But after we sort of get through that initial paperwork, if you will, the judge said he's going to hear arguments in Cole's bid to stay out of prison ahead of trial. Now, earlier this month, the magistrate judge already ruled that Cole would remain locked up pending trial, but he appealed that to Ali. And, it's not as cut and dry as it might seem. And so I think that we're going to have some pretty interesting arguments today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we will be watching to see your reporting on that. Perhaps next week we'll talk about after the hearing what happened now that we've got the preview. But of course, that big case to watch. I know there's also, so I think the snow has gotten some of our hearings mixed up a little bit with some of the schedules and other cases being pushed back. But I know you're also watching some other big cases in the D.C. federal courthouse, including the suspect accused of shooting those two National Guard officers recently as well. So a lot of action happening in the Pretty Man courthouse here in the nation's capital, even if some of those cases might have to wait a few more days until next week. So a lot of action happening there in the trial courts. But Ella, before we do head out, I do want to just touch on one other topic that we have been seeing ripping through the courts, and that is all the way at the top of the chain, and that is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has now, in the last few days, has gotten a new emergency appeal, and it is all about the mid-decade redistricting war. If you remember, let's just rewind the clock to make sure everyone's here on the same page. It began, of course, when Texas Republicans passed their map, adding up to 5 GOP-leaning seats. And now the Supreme Court previously had ruled on Texas's map, saying it could go into effect. And now this is the second of these states that have passed these new maps to reach the Supreme Court. And now it is all flipped, where in Texas it was Republicans, trying to convince the Supreme Court to allow their map to go into effect. It is now the GOP and the Trump administration trying to convince the Supreme Court to block California's map, which is, of course, a Democratic-friendly map that adds potentially up to several Democratic-friendly leaning seats. And now it's going to be all up to the justices what happens with California's map for the midterms, with this emergency appeal coming in from the California GOP, followed very quickly thereafter by a brief in support by the federal government. So this is the ask from the Trump administration and California GOP. They are asking the 9 justices to issue an emergency ruling that would block California's new map from going into effect. Without the Supreme Court's intervention, California's Democratic-friendly map set to go into effect for this year's midterm. So this could be one of the last big decisions that the courts put in, about maps heading into this election cycle, because now we've got states, of course, getting ready to get into their primary season and some of these deadlines coming up. So that'll be the next big emergency case to watch at the Supreme Court, the big battle there on California. And it's going to be interesting, Ella, because when we had the Texas case, at the end of last year, we had this individual concurring opinion from Justice Samuel Alito, who's one of the court's leading conservatives. And of course, one of the things he talked about not only the Texas map in the case, but he made a reference to California's, casting some doubt here on the GOP's arguments that it was drawn for race and not political reasons. So it'll be a really interesting one to watch. Maybe, just maybe, we'll have a ruling by the time we have the show next week. But that does it for us this week here on The Gavel. Thanks so much for being with us. A lot going through the courts in Minnesota and the Supreme Court and everywhere else. We'll be back next week with the latest at the intersection of courts and national politics. But in the meantime, you can sign up for the Gavel newsletter. Get it in your inbox every Wednesday morning by signing up at thehill.com/newsletters. Thanks so much for watching The Gavel, and we'll be back with you next week.